Welcome to, what did I call this again?
Smart things with smart people.
Smart things with smart people. Community foundations and community journalism, recipe for revitalization. If that is not the segment that you wanted to see, please feel free to use the exit doors and go see another session. My name is Dominic Papatola. I'm the Chief Impact Officer for Community Giving, and I am delighted to have you here in St. Cloud with us, actually Wade Park, and really eager to have this conversation. I think Steve Grove did a really great job of doing sort of a place setter. I'm going to add just a little bit of additional context, and I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists. So Steve gave you some numbers. I'm going to give you just a couple of more. Since across the U.S., about 2,500 newspapers have disappeared since 2005. That's about 2 a week. Here in Minnesota, about a quarter of newspapers have closed since 2000, with 60% of those losses occurring in greater Minnesota. Even for the papers that survive, employment in the industry has plummeted by 70%, which I think is about the number that Steve gave you. Many organizations are operating with skeleton crews, struggling to cover news effectively. Staffing shortages persist, with low wages and uncertainty making it difficult to attract and retain journalists. So that's the bad news. There is some good news, and I think the most important thing, and I think this is something that Steve talked about, is that local journalism is still really, really, really important. It celebrates community. It's a watchdog, holding governments, businesses, and institutions accountable, and it's a bulwark against the kind of misinformation that can permeate social media. So I think, simply put, community journalism is a cornerstone of democracy, public safety, community life. Without it, rural communities risk becoming invisible, uninformed, and disconnected. So how do we resolve those seemingly contradictory data points? We have an hour, and these 4 people are going to help us figure it out. There are a lot of different models that have emerged. Steve talked to you about one of the models that the Star Tribune is doing. There are other online news services. There are nonprofit models. There are potential public policy solutions. So we're going to talk a little bit about all of those things, and to help us do so, we have, Reed Anfinson, publisher of the Swift County News, Lisa Schwarz of the Minnesota Newspaper Association, Jonathan Kealing, am I saying that right? Of the Institute for Nonprofit News, and Mukhtar Ibrahim from the Minnesota chapter of Press Forward Minnesota. So, and we will certainly take your questions as well. I got a bunch, so I can go as long as I need to, but I think we'd really much rather hear your questions. But the first question is just kind of the magic wand question. Steve Grove talked a little bit about what the Star Tribune is doing to sort of make journalism in Minnesota better, more effective. If you could wave a magic wand and do one thing to improve the state of journalism in Minnesota, what would you do? And Reed, why don't we start with you and just go down the line? And if you could use the microphone, please.
One thing that's essential to do is to find a funding source for community newspapers in America. And the reason I say America, I served as the president of the National Newspaper Association. And in traveling around the country, we know this. 76% of the communities in America are under 5,000 population, 14,600 of them. They earn 0 to 5% of their income from digital. In an internet-only world, every single community under 5,000 loses its newspaper. Crookston, a town of 7,000, doesn't have a newspaper. And we've seen what happened in St. Cloud, and the losses continue. So we need a funding source. I believe philanthropy plays a role, government plays a role, and our subscribers and our communities and our citizens who are checking out of news have a role.
Thanks, Reed. For some context, I have worked in community newspapers my entire career, starting at the age of 21 or so, including small-town family-owned weekly newspapers, all the way up to, at one point, I was Gannett's Minnesota state editor. So I ran the St. Cloud Times and 9 other news organizations in smaller rural areas across the state. I've kind of seen it all. I believe that if I could wave a magic wand, the first thing I would do to save community journalism is get everyone local funding. Absentee owners generally do not bode well for any business, and absentee owners have become the standard in most community journalism in the United States these days. So if I could wave a magic wand, I would find someone for every single community news organization in the state, like Glenn Taylor. So if you've got a huge pocket of money, or even a smaller pocket of money, consider what that would mean to your community by supporting a local news organization.
I'm going to turn that on.
Here we go.
There we go.
Well, hello, everybody. It's good to see you. I'm going to cheat a little bit. There's two. I want to wave my wand twice.
All right.
I would like you all to help me with one of them. One thing that I think we need is to really reconnect with our audiences. I think we're seeing declining consumption. I think we're seeing real challenges in terms of people feeling like they want to engage with news. And you heard that in Steve's comment, about since 2016, the way their numbers have declined. And that's one thing. And I do think we all share a responsibility in both the value of consuming news and raising that as an issue, but also in what we produce. So that's one stroke of my wand. But the other one is really, I truly believe in this country we're in the midst of a generational effort to convince people that journalism, news, accurate sources of news and information is a civic value, and that it should be supported like all civic institutions in this country are, through a mix of philanthropy, government funding, earned revenue, individual subscription or individual membership gifts. I really think that we're in the process of convincing a generation that news is as important as universities, as libraries, as dance companies, as all those civic institutions, big and small. Whether it's a local theater production, the local library, news is as important as those institutions. And I think we all in this room are in the business of, I hope, making that case, and can be. So this is my invitation to all of you to help join me in making this case across Minnesota that news and journalism should be a civic priority.
I think for me it's very simple. I want everyone who consumes news to be to support. You have to either subscribe, donate, be ambassador for the news organization that you consume. And I think it comes down to the basic of how can you find value in what you are consuming. If there's a local newspaper in your community, if there's a local news nonprofit in your community, is it providing value to your life? And can you go to their website or call their number and give them money voluntarily without anyone asking you? If we can really get to that point, I think we can find a very thriving local news ecosystem. And I founded a nonprofit news organization, and I think the most inspiring thing for me was when I find someone to fill out that long form that anyone has to fill when they're donating to something, and that donation coming across my email. That showed me that what I'm doing was really valuable to that person, that they volunteered to give their money to a nonprofit news organization. So I think if we can really convince our readers, our communities, to take that action, we can overcome this kind of crisis that we are all facing.
Okay, I think we've solved it. Thanks for coming. One of the things that Steve talked about in his comments was we talked about this sort of idea of multiple truths and this idea that there's sort of a sense of eroding trust in at least big national news organizations. And my sense is that that manifests itself differently or to a lesser degree or maybe not at all in local journalism communities, local journalism services. And I guess whoever Reed, you run a paper in a small town, so maybe you could start talking about that, but I'd love to hear what other folks have to say about it as well.
We own the newspapers in Benson, Morris, and Opal Lake, and I'm a journalist. I'm a graduate of the School of Journalism at the University of Minnesota. And the reality is, study after study shows that the local community newspaper reporting is the most trusted in the country. I walk around the corner in the grocery store, and there's somebody I wrote about last week, and they let me know exactly what they think. I'm not distant. I'm local. I'm accessible. And I think that's what's really important to journalism. It also holds us accountable. The last thing I want to do is be embarrassed in front of my community, my family, in a sense. And so we are the most trusted source of journalism in our communities. I think our communities are becoming fractured by a focus on national news. And we're losing that. When we lose newspapers, in Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, he talks about the social capital that people build by participating in organizations together. Well, those local organizations, those bowling leagues, the card clubs, are all disappearing. People are focusing on national news, and we're losing that ability and focus on mutual needs. And I think the community newspaper plays an essential role in building a sense of common responsibility and duty to your community.
Yeah. Mukhtar, you started a nonprofit news organization, and your community is less defined by geography and more defined by a culture. So can you talk a little bit about how you perceive your audiences perceive Sahan Journal in terms of trustworthiness?
Yeah, so Sahan Journal is a nonprofit news organization that mostly focuses on covering issues that are related to immigrants, the Black community, the Latino community, other underserved communities in the state. And the idea came about going through my experience in local newsrooms in the state. I worked for Minnesota Public Radio as a reporter. I worked for the Star Tribune as a City Hall reporter. And not really seeing the stories of these communities reflected well in the coverage that I have been reading and being part of. And that idea was really kind of vivid to me because I was working in those newsrooms and trying to convince my editors, my colleagues to prioritize going beyond the superficial coverage that we often come across when we say a story about the Somali community or the Hmong community, and for them to go out in the community, build trust relationships so that they can uncover the things that those communities care about, their lived experiences, their challenges, their successes, everything in between, and not solely focused on the single story. That's very dangerous. So for us, we wanted to be for the community, by the community, with the community, so that we can reflect who they are as we are covering the communities. And I think when you do that as a reporter, you gain the trust of the community. When you are out in the community, when you're in the mosque, at the church, at the events, when you're covering stories of someone who is running for an office for the first time, and then that person becomes, a senator, and then all of a sudden they are getting all this coverage from the big papers. We want to be the first ones to really cover those issues that will kind of bubble to the surface after a while. And I think the more you are really in the community and trying to capture those issues before anyone knows, it just helps you become very credible in the community. People trust you, people reach out to you, they call you, they email you. They also hold you accountable when you do something that conflicts with their experiences, and they will call you out. And I think that is kind of the trust that we have to overcome, just being in the community, finding their trust, and being in the community, embedded in the community. As Reed said, you are meeting with these communities, everywhere you go, at the grocery store, when you attend the events. And I think we have that powerful responsibility to tell things as they happen in a very vivid way, without really just trying to focus on like a crime that happened in the neighborhood, and then the next time you come back is when someone gets killed. And I think that is kind of the disconnect that we have with the community. And all of us have like devices in our hands now. People are inundated with like information. If you ask like the average person if they are lacking information, it's no. Actually, we are overflowing with information. And now we are here, journalists saying, can you read our paper? Can you go to our website? Can you consume our content? And if I think that's not bringing value to your life and who you are, and if it's not connecting with your community, then you just lose trust, and people will go to TikTok or Twitter or anywhere they get the information. So I think we have this kind of responsibility to really gain the trust of the community by being with the community and staying with them throughout the time, and not just coming back and going on and off.
And as Mukhtar mentioned, Sahan Journal is a nonprofit journalism model. That is a model that has been getting some traction in recent years. I know Sahan is trying to expand its footprint outside of the Twin Cities metropolitan area, but it mainly started in the Twin Cities. And so that makes me want to have a question, Jonathan, for you. When you think about a nonprofit model of journalism, can you talk a little bit about how that can be viable in greater Minnesota in communities that maybe have less immediate access to philanthropic resources?
Yeah, I mean, I think I fully recognize that most businesses are harder to run in small towns. You know, the flight of capital from small communities has been really devastating. The Walmartification of America has really hurt small communities. Now, that said, part of what I think sets the nonprofit model apart is a few things. Number one, it has a really broad base on which it rests. Yes, you know, you hope to see investments from philanthropy, community foundations, individual philanthropists. You still have access to advertising and sponsorship. You still have access to, you know, membership type of giving or subscriptions. And so, you know, there's a saying that nonprofit news isn't a business model. You know, it's a tax status. And there's both truth and falseness in that. You know, nonprofit news is really a set of values. It's about being rooted by law in your community. You know, nonprofit news organizations have to be run by a board of directors that have a fiduciary responsibility and a civic good responsibility. Nonprofits have tax advantage status because they're providing a civic benefit, because they're providing a benefit to the community, and it's that local board, to Lisa's point, you know, local ownership, that is charged with ensuring that that organization provides those benefits to that community and not, you know, returning dollars to faraway hedge funds or shareholders. So I would say that the nonprofit model has, you know, most of the same revenue opportunities as READ does, and potentially, you know, can more easily access philanthropy as well. So what I would say is, you know, nonprofit news brings values-based operation into a community, which I think will align really well with what I know of values from small towns. You know, I saw on the slides in the room in there that the person who traveled from far away had come from Derby, Kansas. And I don't know if that person's in the room, but my cousins grew up in Derby. I was born in Kansas City, so I know what Derby's like. You know, I've been there. I've been to a wedding in Derby. And I think about places like Derby and places like, you know, all sorts of small towns across Minnesota. You know, whether it's Swift County, where Reed's got one of his publications, or I don't know, one of the reservations, Leech Lake or something like that. I mean, those are all places that value connection and value each other, and I think nonprofit news organizations bring that as well. So I would say it works because the nonprofit model is about community benefit and community ownership, and I know those are values that are really strongly felt in rural communities.
Lisa, you represent the sort of newspaper, the media industry, the news industry writ large in Minnesota. So I wonder what Jonathan just said, kind of where your Venn diagram overlaps and where you think there's a little bit of a difference maybe.
First of all, I want to make it clear that the Minnesota Newspaper Association has both nonprofit and for-profit membership. We are clearly much stronger on the for-profit side simply because for 160 some years of our existence as an association, for-profit news was the dominant model. So, right, that was nearly the only model. It is important to recognize that everything Jonathan said about values-based journalism is 100% correct. But I will also point out that there are approximately 250 operating newspapers, most of them have websites as well, across Minnesota. That number tends to shock folks, but I know you guys this audience is very in touch with what's happening in their community. I doubt that you're as surprised as most audiences. Of those 250 or so members, the vast majority are either locally owned or regionally owned. They're folks like Reed, who has, you know, a handful of newspapers in a geographic area that he is deeply connected to. We have solo ownership that are technically for-profit, but they are effectively running like nonprofits. So I think that it is important to understand that there is a place for locally owned, for-profit news to serve all of those same values and all of those important things that will create trust in local journalism. That said, I believe that we will see, I believe, this is my personal opinion, right now I'm not speaking on behalf of the association, but I believe that we're going to see more and more not for-profit organizations trying to find their way with either a full nonprofit status or accessing philanthropy to help them fulfill their mission to their communities.
Yeah. Reed, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that your papers are not as close to the digital eclipse as Steve and the Star Tribune is, that your digital subscriptions are bigger than your print subscriptions. Assuming that's the case, talk a little bit about what publications like yours are doing and can do to evolve.
It's not even close.
You have
Not
that
even
many
close.
digital subscriptions?
We have digital subscriptions, but they aren't even close. And if they're growing, it's because of the horrendous quality of the postal delivery that we have to people who aren't local. And, newspapers have been compared to dinosaurs and buggy whips and things like that. But I think they're more like another ancient technology, the windmill. It's been reinvented, it's across the landscape, and it prevents clean energy for America. While newspapers with their PDF sites and their websites and their print are the clean information technology for democracy. And I think that we play a role there in changing people's mind. But again, we just make pennies on the dollar. And I had once heard that the New York Times, this goes back a while, had a newsroom of 1,400, and in a digital world they were 300. Print is what pays for journalism. And so we need print, and but we are looking at different options. We do have to give our readers different ways of reading our newspapers.
Yep. And sort of given just a follow-up question for you, Reed, given what I imagine are probably pretty narrow margins, what's sort of within the realm of possibility for you and papers like yours?
As far as making more money?
Yeah. Or trying, I mean, I'm assuming you can't spend a bunch of money rolling out a digital platform, for instance. So
No.
what else is
Well,
there?
you learn to realize that so in a world where you're already working far more than 40 hours a week, and people start talking about, why don't you start doing events? Well, my staff doesn't have time for events, for a one-time or two-time-a-year events to make some extra money on the side. They're overwhelmed the way it is, and our focus is producing news. And we do a pretty good job of it in our 3 communities. So we really have to figure out a way of solidifying the foundation of print news. Now, there are issues with going nonprofit. We lose our editorial independence. And what is the value of that? I am somewhat disappointed in the Star Tribune with its, I've noticed it, and I don't know if any of you have, but they don't write nearly as many editorials as an institution as they used to. I think that's kind of escaping some responsibility on their part. The newspaper always had on signed editorials because we're speaking with the voice of the newspaper, and I still believe that has value.
Yeah. Mukhtar, you are a consultant for the Press Forward initiative in Minnesota. The Press Forward initiative is part of it. The Minnesota effort is part of a national effort to use philanthropy to help leverage new models in journalism. I have the pleasure of serving on the steering committee. Katina also works with the Press Forward initiative, and I think I may have a couple other folks in the room as well. And I know, Mukhtar, one of the things that we're talking about is, we have significant resources, but not unlimited resources. And so I would much rather have you talk about sort of like early days. We've just done our first grant round, and we're talking about what we want the second grant round to look like. But early days, what are we learning?
Yeah, so Press Forward is the local chapter. Press Forward Minnesota is the local chapter of Press Forward National, which is this national initiative that's trying to activate the local philanthropic community to see journalism as civic institution that should be supported. So we gave out the first grant of the Press Forward Minnesota in January, a couple of months ago. and trying to really see how we can invest in the dollars that we raised from the local foundations, including, McKnight Foundation, Bush Foundation, and MacArthur Foundation, and other, partners in small organizations across the country that are really serving informational needs of their communities. So we learned that there are really amazing vibrancy in our state. A lot of very small organizations that are covering specific niches or community or undercovered topics and areas, and the need is very huge. That we need to really make sure we are activating all the local foundations across the state. If you are in a state, if you're in a place that has a foundation, we would love to talk and chat so we can find ways to support your local news ecosystem. And this is a 5-year initiative, so we have a 5-year window to see what we can do with that time frame, what we can learn, what insights we can gather, and hopefully we will have, by the end of the 5 years, more foundations like McKnight and Bush's and other foundations that can step up and see journalism as a tool that should be supported. And our goal is to really make sure we are raising enough money to support all organizations. We are supporting for-profit and nonprofits. So we are not solely focused on nonprofits. We are also trying to see small papers across the state, what we can do to help them thrive, for them to transform their organizations, and if they want to launch a website or a product or something like that, or hire someone, a reporter, editor, based on their need, how can we support that? And I think we are just starting out, and the goal is to really activate the philanthropic community. That's the biggest goal for us, to fundraise and talk to the Blending Foundation, to other community foundations, to foundations in Duluth, Rochester, other places, small communities, and even major dollars, people with means to give and support their local news ecosystem, to see journalism like something that needs to be supported and not forgotten. And the early signs are really showing us that the community is kind of waking up to this need right now, as more papers close down or lay off staff, and there's a big void in knowing what's going on at your local school board, for example, who is running for to sit on the board of your school, and there's huge decisions that they make. And if you don't have a place that covers that and sheds a light and informs you, then you just you will never know what's happening in that particular community. So Press Forward is early. We are just in year 2. We learned a lot, but we think there's a huge opportunity for us to travel across the state, talk to foundations and founders and people with philanthropy, to educate them about what local news is, how things have been evolving, the business model, and how they can play a part in that kind of revival and strengthening of the local news ecosystem. And we are very clear, philanthropy alone is not the solution. We see the policy as part of the solution. We see the local businesses advertising in their local papers as part of the solution. We see the community donating, subscribing to their papers and local news organizations as part of the solution. So we are trying to really make sure we are convincing, educating, raising a lot of awareness about the need for local journalism to be supported.
Yeah. Thanks, Mukhtar. You talked about, as did Steve Grove, talked about public policy as potentially part of the solution. Not a great political environment, especially at the federal level. Some of you maybe saw Marjorie Taylor Greene's hearings, at which she brought the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the Public Broadcasting Service, up to the Hill and had some questions for them. So that's one corner. There are a lot of other policy areas. So I guess, Lisa, how can policymakers support rural journalism? And I guess what can local communities and local people do to sort of help facilitate that support?
Sure. The Minnesota Newspaper Association, the Minnesota Broadcasters Association, all those folks, one of the biggest expenditures of our associations is, and always has been, policy. We spend a lot of money at the Capitol every year trying to protect the public's right to know, trying to protect transparency in government, your access to public meetings and your access to public records. No one else is doing that. It's journalism, it's journalists that are paying for that work to be done on behalf of the rest of the state. So that's my clarion call to care about policy surrounding journalism. The way policy can help support journalism that serves your communities and does all that other important work around transparency in government and good government is by engaging with your leadership. That will be state and local folks. Public notice is a huge point of contention every year at the legislature. There are lots and lots of organizations, some of them that do a lot of good work, that are trying very hard not to have to spend that money anymore to publish their proceedings, their agendas, their new ordinances, that kind of thing. And that is something that I think is important for citizens to speak out about. Right now, there are several policy initiatives that we are working with legislators, including one that would help solidify public notice, one that would basically, we're working really hard to keep a 2% tax on advertising from coming to us, because that would be a significant issue for nonprofit and for-profit news, which would be passed along to Main Street businesses, probably, or simply stress local news organizations even further. And we are working on something that we think is pretty positive, which is a bill that would encourage, it doesn't require, but it encourages all state agencies to spend at least half of their marketing budgets in local news organizations. That can be radio, it can be nonprofit online only, it can be print, it can be whatever they like. But that spending used to support local news organizations, and it has gone away as the business models broke down with the advent of Google, which, if you've been watching the news, we just got a couple of very important rulings down there that did in fact confirm that Google has been running advertising monopolies that have hurt local news organizations. So we'll see if anything comes from that. It's important for spending by local businesses, local governments, and state governments to support local news organizations. There will be much more policy work to come. We're forming a coalition. The Press Forward is forming a coalition among news organizations across Minnesota to put together policy plans that will help support local news into the future. Because as Mukhtar pointed out, there is not enough money to do this just with philanthropy. We cannot save community organizations that are providing you with news simply with philanthropy. It's a piece of the puzzle. I will point out that both Press Forward National, some other national organizations, and Press Forward Minnesota have got eye-popping commitments to support local journalism. But when you start to do the math and divide what that means, divide it up among the local news organizations who need the support, it's a pittance. It's, it's great that it's happening, but there's no way that they're going to save it.
Can I jump in and
I was going to ask both you and Reed to jump in. I guess what I wanted to lift up from Lisa's comment is it's great to hear that there's some proactive things happening, because the first part of your answer was like defense. We have to make sure this doesn't get taken away. We have to make sure that doesn't get taken away. So I'd love to hear more about kind of like if there are proactive things that can be done.
So just a couple things that I agree with all that Lisa said. I wanted to raise up one thing, because it sort of speaks to something that I hear. Philanthropy is not the only answer to saving news, but I do think it has to be an enduring part of the answer to what saves news going forward, because sometimes I'll be talking to national funders or, other media people who are like, okay, so once we put this $500 million in, everything's going to be good, right? And we can go do something else. And I want to dissuade anyone of thinking that, that's the case. Philanthropy, as I said at the beginning, really has to recognize that this is part of the philanthropic space now, and we need your long-term partnership. So I want to call that out. Another thing I wanted to do is just, Lisa talked about the proposal to direct government funding back into news. And this isn't something that Minnesota is trying to do, first everywhere. This is really, it was first kind of pioneered in New York City, but has expanded to other cities and states and has been really effective both for media and for government. And so that's something where, these organizations historically did invest in news, and now they're investing in giant tech companies that, I'm not immune to using Facebook and Google and all of that, but I think there's a pretty significant body of research out there that suggests those sites may actually not be doing very good things for us in our communities, and yet that we're investing a lot of tax dollars into those sites when we could be investing into local news organizations. So I just want to raise up that that's an idea that is really well tested out there. And then the last thing I wanted to say was, public policy solutions for news do not have to be a red-blue issue. We see in exceedingly red states where, like, Steve talked about this, the prospect of a small business advertising tax credit where they get 50 or 75% of their spend back as a tax credit is really popular in very conservative states, and it can help news. So there are we don't just have to think about this in the Marjorie Taylor Greene sense. This is really something that crosses all lines.
I just want to jump in and point out that the best part is that many of these proposals are budget neutral. Redirecting state marketing dollars to local news organizations, which have extremely good audience, is they're going to get their money's worth for it. Doesn't cost the state or the taxpayers an additional dime.
I'm also one of the Swift County Monitor was one of the press forward grantees out of 40 newspapers in America that got one. And with that, I'm working on a couple things. This out of sight, out of mind campaign that we're working on basically says Eddie Bauer sends you a catalog for one reason. It knows 6 months from now, if it stops sending a catalog, LL Bean will start taking part of Eddie Bauer's share. Out of sight, out of mind. And that applies for democracy too. I'm working on advertising and other things that would go along with that theme. Madison and Jefferson, at the founding of the country, knew that to have a legitimate democracy, you had to have an informed electorate. And Madison said that we were on our way to a tragedy or a farce without an informed electorate. And I think we're headed that way right now. The internet was supposed to be this promise of this broad education of the American public. It's proved exactly the opposite. It's full of disinformation. And so the community newspaper, that print version of the newspaper, is something solid in the community that people pay attention to. And I think it has a value. I think of, what happened in District 40B and the disaster that we had in Minnesota legislature this year? You know what happened in District 40B? The Lilly newspaper closed. There was no reporter in that community to report on whether or not that candidate for that 40B seat was a legitimate candidate. And it froze our legislature for 6 weeks? That was the loss of that newspaper. There would have been a reporter there reporting on that. I did reporting on that on Senator Tory Westrom in our Senate district when he was charged with not being a resident of his new district. And it was through our research on those stories that he eventually established his residency in the proper district. It went to court, and he did win, but it was marginal. And so, and public notice, another thing, Lisa, that I'm going to work on here, I think we'll do legislatively. I've proposed it to my brother Mark is the attorney for the State Newspaper Association. It's helpful. And one of the arguments we get against public notice that school districts will say, we can't use public notice money for education. And it sounds like a pretty legitimate argument. So let's have the legislature put a fraction of the funding that goes to school districts into a dedicated percentage of the taxes that goes to public notice advertising. So it's not taken away from education, it's not taken from the advertising of your city or your employees in your city or your county. It's dedicated to public advertising in the newspapers, not just public notice. But if you have a wind and solar ordinance that's changing, that's going to affect people's lives, they advertise that. When are the street days for your plowing emergencies? All that advertising could be budgeted through maybe a levy at the state legislature, just a fraction for local governments, and that would help community newspapers.
Go
One
ahead.
last thing. I'm gonna drop this one. I truly believe that newspapers should be part of the legacy fund, and I'm just gonna let that marinate a little bit.
Okay. You've got a room full of community foundation people here, hostage for the next 15, 20 minutes or so. Community foundations have access to a lot of resources. They have dollars, but they have social resources, they have moral resources, they have intellectual resources, they have reputational resources. So if you could give one message to the community foundation board members that are sitting here or staff that are sitting here, the next time they go to one of their board meetings, and if the first answer is, well, we don't have the kind of discretionary grant making to give money to local journalism, what do you want their plan B to be? What do you want them to ask their boards of their organizations and their communities to do?
I'm going to say that it's important for community foundations and funders of all kinds to think about what happens with the next generation. And I don't mean the next generation of humans, I mean the next generation of ownership and operators of news organizations across the state, for-profit or nonprofit. It is important for you to understand that the majority of news organizations that have ceased to exist in Minnesota in the last 15 to 20 years have not gone away because they were not profitable. Some have, but the majority have gone away because there was no one to take them over. That is something that I believe that local community foundations can play a big role in perhaps helping to identify who those next players are in your own communities and help them understand the resources that are available to them through small business loans or any other kind of support that you can access or direct them to. Entrepreneurial training, which is vitally important, and take that next step. Platform agnostic, whether it's a newspaper, whether it's a radio station, whether it's a nonprofit online news organization, whether it's a for-profit online news organization. Who is going to do this next? Solo operators are aging out and they're burning out. As Reed pointed out, they're not working 40 hours a week. And frankly, no operators are working 40 hours a week, whether you're corporate or solo. These folks are eating, sleeping, and breathing their communities. They're at the softball diamond, they're at the city council meeting, they're at the school board meeting, they're at the zoning board meeting. They're making your kid a star, and they're running letters to the editor, and they're making sure the senior menus get published. And it's exhausting as a 365-day-a-year proposition. They're gonna burn out, and that's okay, that's the normal cycle of life. Who's next? Help support those folks.
I never worked at a community foundation, but when I think of a community foundation, I think of organizations and people that are dedicated to maintaining and building vibrant, healthy communities where they are. There is so much research out there that shows what happens when you lose local news in your community. Civic participation goes down, fewer people vote because they say, I don't know what I'm voting for. You know, forget the page of judges on the back of my ballot. I don't even know who's running for city councilors or school board. The cost of government goes up because there's less there's less attention to those contracts and what's going on at City Hall. The odds of a person getting to know and interact with someone who doesn't look like or think like them goes down when journalism leaves a community. And so if you care about a vibrant and healthy community, which I truly believe you all do, you need to think about news in that context. And then the other thing that I will just share is the story of Eden Prairie Local News, which was really started as an effort by Mark Weber at the Eden Prairie Community Foundation, who saw the loss of their local newspaper in Eden Prairie and said, we do not want to be a community without news. And he rallied people, he rallied dollars, and created what I think is probably the most positive. I mean, don't get me wrong, I know Eden Prairie is not small in the grand scheme of things in Minnesota, but it's not giant. It is a community, and he rallied that community to create, I think, one of the most successful local news startups in Minnesota in quite some time on the local level. Is it Sahan Journal? No, but Sahan Journal's got a different mission. Eden Prairie Local News' mission is to serve Eden Prairie, and it was through work convened at the Community Foundation that organization got off the ground. And so I encourage you all to think about the role you could play in your community.
When I launched Sahan Journal in 2019, the first grant I got was from the St. Paul and Minnesota Community Foundation. So if you are from that foundation and you're here, thank you so much. I think if you need us to talk to your board staff about the importance of local news and journalism, please invite us. We will make time for it. My colleagues May Yang and Katina Mortensen are here. Katina is here, May is not here. We will love to talk to your board and staff and tell them about why journalism is important. I think every community foundation has program areas, priorities, and if no one is covering those issues, you will never know what's going on. If you care about economic justice, health, education, democracy, and if there's no journalism, if there's no one telling the deep research that an organization has done, and a reporter covering that research and talking to the people who conducted the research and talking to the community and all that stuff, you will never know what's going on. So I think journalism is a tool that's very helpful in informing people, shaping ideas, making you better informed so you can make better decisions, better grant making. And journalism, you should see journalism as a central part of your strategy. And if you eliminate that, I think you will not make a very good, well-informed decision. So please invite us to your board meetings, to your staff. We would love to talk about this issue. It's really important, especially now when there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of polarization, a lot of disinformation going on. Journalism is going to be the vital tool that will really help us make better decisions, be well connected, have a sense of belonging across our communities.
I think we have to do a greater job of working with philanthropies, but I think philanthropies can also do a great job of advertising the need to get more funding dedicated to journalism. I think that Lisa said, and this is very true, who replaces me in Benson, Minnesota? I have been told multiple times I can't retire because people are afraid of what will happen. And who would be the likely buyer of the Swift County Monitor News and the Stevens County Times and the Grant County Herald? Not somebody local, unless I can facilitate a way for young people to buy those newspapers together, maybe as a group. Under the Farm Bill, and I'd love to pattern some legislation for journalism under the Farm Bill. There's the Beginning Farmer Program. There's a beginning asset purchase agreements for farmers. You could take that Farm Bill at the state and both the federal level, and you could just cross out farmer and you could put in newspaper or journalist. And one of my columns I wrote, I said, is a newspaper worth one farmer? We know that in the U.S. Constitution's Bill of Rights, freedom of the press is guaranteed. The revolution wasn't fought over making sure farmers could farm, it was making sure that we had an educated electorate. And so we could maybe incorporate some things into that bill. It's a challenge because I know I serve on the Center for Rural Policy Development's board. We get funding to help us, but we see grant organizations change priorities. And they fund us for a while and then they move on to something else. So we need to know the consistency of the funding will remain, is the last thing.
Great food for thought and great calls to action. So we are so fortunate to have these excellent, creative, wise minds at the table. And I hope that you have some questions for, yes, indeed.
You know me, Dominic. I can't keep my mouth shut. I really don't have a question. I do have a comment. First, I'm Joe Corfett from the Paynesville Area Community Foundation. And I want to thank each of you for being here, kind of opening me up, giving me a better idea of media, especially from, say, local newspapers. And Reed, I definitely want to thank you. I know we're somewhat close together as far as Paynesville and the Benson area. But I never really thought about a local newspaper and just the influence that it had until I'm on the school board, Paynesville School Board, until we last year were going out to get a levy as far as just renewing a levy for technologies. And as school board members, we talked about how do we get the word out to the community. And then as we do that, what else, what other questions? We wanted to feel just what it was, as far as the folks out there within the school district, what they thought about renewing this levy, but then also other questions so we have an idea of how the community members see the school district. One of the questions was, how would you like to, or how do you receive communications? And there was a organization out of Wisconsin that conducted the survey for us. And when they gave us the debrief on it, they were shocked, and me as a school board member was also shocked, about the age of 55 up to 85, that range, the way that they wanted to get their communication was through a newspaper. And we do have the Paynesville Press in our little community. And then started right around that 20 to 20-year-old up to about the 40, 45, early 50s. Of course, it was all social media. We don't understand what that means. Is it just through Facebook? Is it through things that are set out through the school as far as emails and stuff like that? But we were very shocked that newspapers are very, very, very important, at least in the Paynesville area for the school board and how we communicate with each other. So thank you, Reed, for keeping your business going.
As far as for a school levy, there is so much information that has to get out to the public. And this is another point about having local journalists. They have to understand this to write about it. Now, does this levy apply to 1 acre and the farm buildings around it, or does it apply to all their ag land? What is the increase in the levy on a house worth $100,000, $200,000, or $300,000? You have to know those things. And I can guarantee you one thing. I am the only reporter at 95% of the meetings I cover. When people tell me they get their news off their phone, I say define news. It sure as heck isn't the information about the local levy and its impact on their community. What you're going to get on social media is the people who are against the levy, and the people who are for it. But nobody in the middle is going to say, here's the impact of this levy and here's what it means to you. And here's what it means to your children. If it doesn't pass, we are going to lose our music program in our school district. So nobody else is there to dive into that and report it. And that's why the print newspaper, again, which only exists in a print world. And as far as our advertising goes, and as far as our financial security goes, there's several reasons. The internet, we know, stole our advertising and monetize it to become billionaires. But it's the regionalization and nationalization of our business. We had 2 fantastic pharmacies that were local to us in our community. They're now owned by Thrifty White. Thrifty White could care less about the local newspaper. It's the regionalization and nationalization of our car dealerships, let's say, with media buyers in the Twin Cities who know nothing about a community newspaper. It's our rural population loss. So we're facing multiple headwinds in surviving as community newspapers. But only the newspaper is going to give you that news you need.
Okay, my name is Sharif Ahmed. I'm the current chair of the Paynesville Foundation. Just a quick question. I grew up in Bangladesh, and I think I started reading newspapers when I was in 4th, 5th grade, and it was a big deal when the paper showed up. And as late 60s, early 70s, I used to listen to shortwave radio, if somebody knows what that is, the Voice of America, BBC, and also Radio Australia. And even then, during the Vietnam and the Watergate, I figured out the difference in coverage between the VOA and the BBC. Then I showed up at the U of M, and I was dumbfounded. The newspaper would show up in the lounge, and I'm the only one reading the paper because all my other dorm mates would read the funnies or the sports page, and that's it. My question has to do with the newspaper is a business, and you need revenue. So far it has come from ads. How do you build customers? What do we do for the next generation of readers, which is the kids, which is the students? How do you get them thinking in those terms is one part. And the other part is how do you fight this notion that newspaper is free because you will pay $8, $10 bucket for a popcorn if you go to a movie, if you still go to a movie, but you won't pay $5 for a news item. And as we heard today, there is a price and a cost. If you don't pay, all sort of bad things happen. So how do we handle those two parts?
I'm going to start with the first part, which is, sports pages and comic sections and, frankly, lifestyles, recipes. We had a beer reporter for a while at the St. Cloud Times. Those have always been the gateway drugs. That is the sizzle that gets people to pick up the news product, and then hopefully you can catch them with the issues while they're there. So that's all part of the plan, and lots of news organizations do that. I believe that one of the most important things that we can do to pass that news habit down to younger consumers on any platform is to remember that as much as I personally love print, and my job depends on print newspapers, I also want to say, don't forget that when people are saying that they're getting their news from social media or they're getting their news online, they may very well be getting that social media information from the local newspaper's Facebook page. They may very well be getting their news online from the Star Tribune's website. The idea that if people don't respond that they read it in a newspaper, that they're not getting that news from a newspaper or other news organization, radio station, whatever, you need to be smarter as consumers of data to understand what that may really mean. I believe that there are better studies to be done that can tell us what that data really is, and we haven't done them yet. As far as the financial, the business model, so here's what happened to news in America. Newspapers used to be, the joke was, when you'd give a tour, a publisher would give a tour of his printing facility, and someone would say, hey, I bet you could print some money with that. And the publisher would say, yeah, but I'd have to take a pay cut. The profit margins in local news, in newspapers and other forms of local news, radio as well, were astronomical until the early 2000s, like factors of 10 over what normal retail profit margins were. When that fell apart, when Craigslist came along and took away classified advertising, and then when Google and others started running effectively advertising monopolies, and when our industry made the huge mistake of saying, yeah, we'll give it away for free and eventually that will make us money, I will never get my head around that decision, it fell apart. And that is why you were seeing in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, you were seeing newsrooms of 50, 60, 70 people in communities this size, and now they're down to single digits if they're lucky. Just a second, I just want to finish my point and then you're up. It's important to understand that the crisis is not in audience. It's not in consumption of news, mostly. The crisis is in funding of news reporting and making sure that that reporting is solid and inclusive. If we don't fund it, we will have the escalating crisis of audience.
I'm going to just make one quick comment. The basics of the responsibility in news is news readers. And we're doing a lousy job at the high school and even the elementary level of teaching civics to our kids. If our kids know no civic responsibility, they have no interest in reading the news. And that's what we need. I've seen maybe twice a high school student show up at a public meeting I attend. It should be required. They have to learn civic engagement in order to want to be engaged with their newspaper.
Back to your question, I think the revenue part and the audience customer part are very related. And for me, it comes down to, am I bringing value to your life? Can you if you go to a website or get a newspaper, are you able to subscribe to that paper or donate? And I think if we can overcome that, we might solve some of the challenges that we are facing, because if I'm covering a community and the issues I'm covering that community doesn't care about, I mean, yeah, there's a mismatch of, product market fit, as they say in business school. So I think, we covered St. Paul public schools. There was a big school board race, and there wasn't enough coverage of who is running for office. And when we did a voter guide of, all the people who are running for that office, during election day, people were spending around 8 minutes on that story. They want to know who is running for a school board in their district. And we saw a huge wave of donations of people really donating because they found that voter guide some value. It made them to make a better decision when they go to that voting booth and who they're going to select to sit on the school board. They are making a good, well-informed decision because of the story they read. And they were driven to kind of click donate, fill this long form like your name, address. You have to put your credit card information, and then go through all these verifications and donate. And I think most reporters just think about things when they are just covering issues, but we need to assess the informational needs of the community and kind of get that value across the customer so that they will become a subscriber or donor.
Okay, and I think we're going to have to leave it there. We are out of time. What I wanted for this session was for people who sat in it to walk out with something that they could do. So I hope you are taking something tangible out of this session. Mukhtar, Jonathan, Lisa, Reed, thank you so much for your wisdom. We appreciate it.